Today I have a story for you guys about this kid who actually thought that Garten of Banban was real, and not only does he claim that it's real, he also claims that he went to kindergarten there, and that he was trapped in there and had to escape it. Like the video or else Banban will eat you. Trust me guys, he's very hungry. Also subscribe so we can hit 69 trillion subscribers, which we're getting super close to. So let's just get me there real quick, and yeah, anyways, without any further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. So for this story, we're gonna call our subscriber Nick. And one day, whenever Nick got to school, he heard people discussing and talking about how there's gonna be a new student showing up that day. People didn't really know much. All they knew is that it was a guy and that he was gonna be in the same grade as them. So Nick gets to his first class of the day, which is history, which by the way, that would absolutely suck. Every time I had history, it was during the middle of the day. I could not imagine having history first thing in the morning. Like, as I'm trying to wake up and not be so tired first thing in the morning after only getting like 3 hours of sleep or whatever, I'm really not trying to hear a lullaby about George Washington. Anyways, after the bell rings and history class starts, probably like 5 or 10 minutes later, the principal shows up with this kid and she introduces him to the class. And she's like, this is Tommy, he's a pretty interesting kid, and why don't you go sit over right there next to Nick. Nick's a pretty cool kid and you can get to know him. So then the principal walked Tommy over to the desk sitting right next to Nick's, and then she said to Tommy that if there's anything he needed to just let her know, and wished him a good first day at the new school. Then she walked away and class continued. So as the history teacher was talking about what happened back in the year 69, Tommy looks over to Nick and waves at him and says, "What's up?" And then Nick, being nice, said, "What's up?" And they were talking for maybe about 5 minutes until eventually Tommy brought up this crazy thing. He was talking about how he likes this new area in school way better than the last one he was at. And then he started talking about his old school and how bad it was. He was like, yeah, my school was so bad. The people there were evil. They made me sit in the naughty corner, and they even made me feed this creepy bird. And this whole time they're whispering because, you know, class is in session, but they're towards the back of the class. And also, of course, the teacher would be more forgiving because this is Tommy's first day at school. And the principal did sit Tommy right next to Nick so then they could talk to each other and maybe get to know each other. They also weren't being too loud, so it wasn't too much of a big deal. Anyways, Nick responded to what Tommy had said, and he was like, what, they had a naughty corner? That sounds awful. And Tommy was like, yeah, I had to sit in the naughty corner all the time. And the bird was really, really creepy. And Nick responded and he was like, I wish our school let us feed birds. That sounds like fun. Like, you guys had a pet bird or what? And Tommy, sounding pretty scared out of nowhere, was like, yeah, it was a pet, but not the type of pet that you want. And Nick was pretty confused by this, but he just kind of ignored it. And eventually the teacher was like, all right, that's enough. We got to listen to the lesson. And Tommy looked over to Nick and he was like, sit with me at lunch. I have to tell you about everything. It's seriously crazy. And Nick was like, okay, I guess. You know, he didn't want to be mean to the new kid at school, but also he was pretty confused, and it was just pretty odd to him, the stuff that Tommy was trying to talk to him about, like an evil pet bird or something. But yeah, regardless, lunchtime came around, and Nick was already sitting down at the table eating, and then Tommy came over and took a seat right next to him. As he slammed down his tray, he was like, all right, listen up, Nick. I have something to tell you. And now this is serious, all right? You can't tell anybody about it. And Nick was like, oh, okay. You know, all right, tell me what you got to tell me. And Tommy was like, this is gonna sound crazy and you probably aren't gonna believe me, but you just need to listen, okay? Nick, still very confused, agreed, and Tommy started telling his story. Before I moved here, I went to a different school, Tommy said, but not just any school. It was Banban's kindergarten, and let me tell you, it was terrifying. Now, Nick actually knew what Banban's kindergarten was, and he was like, wait, I think I've heard of that before on a YouTube video or something. Tommy was like, yeah, that's what I was talking about. They made a video game after it, and I used to go there, like, it's real. Nick was like, well, I don't think I remember it too well, but isn't that a video game about monsters and stuff? Like, there's no way monsters are real. And Nick was like, I knew it. I knew you wouldn't believe me, all right? And just as he was about to get up and leave in disappointment, Nick was like, no, I never said I don't believe the story. Just, you know, tell me first. Sit back down. You know, I want to hear the story. And Tommy was like, okay, well, you just have to believe me on this though, okay? Like, I'm telling you right now, that's why I'm at this school right now. That's why I had to move and everything. And Nick was like, okay, fine. Continue on then. So then Tommy continued on in his story. He talked about how Banban's kindergarten was a absolutely scary, horrific place, and how all of the teachers and the employees at the school were not people and they were monsters who roamed the halls. He started listing off a bunch of different characters. He gave the bird that he said he had to feed eggs earlier a name. He called it a Pila bird and said that it always hung around where they had recess at, but also they would sometimes see it wandering the halls. They said that they had a teacher who they called Bombalina, and said said that anytime he got an answer wrong in her class, bad things would happen. So Tommy just kept listing different characters, kind of describing them to Nick. And Nick sometimes would be like, oh, I've heard of that one before, or, you know, never heard of that one. I don't know who that is. But he was familiar with a few of the characters from the game, which he saw a YouTuber play at one point. And whenever Nick was like, yeah, no, I recognize him, Tommy would be like, yeah. They look exactly like they do in the game in real life too. Now, this whole time, Nick really isn't buying it, but he's pretending like he kind of is just to listen to the story. He wants to hear what Tommy has to say. As of now, Nick just thinks that Tommy is a little cuckoo. Which, I mean, so do I. But who knows? Maybe it's true. Maybe it's real. Maybe Bonbon is real and he's gonna eat you if you don't like my YouTube video. That will still happen if you haven't liked yet, by the way. So double check. Like, seriously. Anyways, Tommy then goes on to talk about how he basically lived at the school and how he had to follow very strict guidelines. Otherwise, like he said, very bad things would happen. Now, Nick says that anytime Tommy recounts something like one of these bad moments, he seriously looks absolutely horrified as if he's telling the truth. Like, it's almost believable to Nick despite how ridiculous the things he's saying is, because he does seem genuinely terrified. Anyways, Tommy goes on to say that one day during recess, he was talking to one of his classmates that for some reason was dressed up as a bowling pin, like in a bowling pin costume. And this classmate basically told Tommy that this wasn't a school whatsoever, rather it was a secret facility that was using this substance called Javanium to create these monsters. Tommy says that after he was told that, he was absolutely terrified of that place, which he already was a bit before. Now he said that he realized that he had to leave and get out of there. Tommy said to Nick that all along he thought that this was a real school and that he had to be there because, you know, it's like school. But then after the classmates started talking to him about some stuff and he realized that he didn't even remember how he got to the school in the first place, he decided that he had to get the heck out of that school ASAP. Nick at this point was still listening in, and he was just like, so, what did you do about that? And Tommy seemed pretty happy that he got asked more questions about this, and he happily went on to talk about how he, quote-unquote, outsmarted the creatures. He said that he fed the bird eggs and tricked it to give him a yellow key card. He claimed that he solved a bunch of different puzzles to avoid Bambalina, and that he even outran Nab through a maze of corridors. And Tommy, of course, was going into more greater details about all of these things, but Nick, of course, couldn't remember everything that he was being told, so that's just kind of like a general idea. Anyways, Tommy was like, yeah, I was able to escape though, and my parents finally decided to put me back into school this year, so that's why I'm here. And Nick was like, wow, that's really cool. Eventually, as Tommy was telling this story, Nick even stopped talking about how he's heard of that in a YouTube video or whatever before, despite him hearing that in a YouTube video before, and he was pretty sure he knew what was going on and that Tommy was just making up stories about this video game. Maybe he was hoping that Nick didn't know about it, but even after Nick said that he knew the video game, he still continued on to tell him the story, and he was even claiming that the game was based off of the school, which, I mean, just sounds absolutely absurd, but Tommy was still telling the tale, I guess. Tommy would also tell Nick about how he would always have nightmares about that place, and how he still thinks that Bonbon is out to get him. Anyways, school lunch ended, and Nick didn't have any more classes with Tommy for the rest of the day. And I guess during the rest of the classes that Tommy had that day, he spent it telling other classmates about his quote-unquote experience at Bonbon's kindergarten. Because the next day at school, whenever Nick showed up, tons of people were talking about Tommy's story about the Garten of Banban, and some kids were actually genuinely believing his story. And now they too were believing that Garten of Banban was real life. But then, of course, others didn't believe it whatsoever, and actually started making fun of Tommy a bit. And even one kid made fun of Nick for talking to him. He came up to Nick and was like, how's it being friends with the kid who thinks that Roblox games are real? And Nick honestly just didn't know what to say, and he just kind of ignored him and walked away. And he went to his history class where Tommy was sitting there waiting. Tommy was like, so after lunch, we didn't really have that much time to talk. Like, what do you think about all of it? You never really told me. And Nick was like, listen, I do want to believe it. I really do, Tommy. But this sounds just like the video game. And also, I don't think I believe in monsters. And Tommy was like, I knew it. I knew you wouldn't believe me. And he like crossed his arms and pouted. And eventually he put his head down, and no matter how many times the teacher or Nick or any of the other students tried talking to him, he would just sit there and like groan, wouldn't say anything at all, and was just ignoring everybody, until eventually, after enough people started bugging him, he got up and he started screaming. He was like, you guys don't know what I've been through. Garten of Banban is real, and I knew that nobody would believe me. And then he got up and ran out of the classroom, bawling his eyes out. A few seconds passed of just awkward silence, and then eventually one Some kids started laughing, and then a ton of the class started laughing. But Nick just sat there in deep thought, thinking about why Tommy was so passionate about this, why he was crying over this, and why he was actually so, like, genuinely mad that people don't believe him. Nick was starting to truly wonder if Tommy may have been telling the truth this whole time, which would be insane, but for him to be crying and screaming like that is pretty crazy. So Nick also left the classroom, and he went to the bathroom to try and find Tommy. He heard weeping coming from one of the stalls, and he knocked on it, and he was like, "Hey, Tommy, I know it's you in there. This is Nick. Can we just talk? Like, I'm sorry." And Nick was like, "No, you don't even believe in Opal Bird. Just go away." And Nick was like, "No, dude, I think I do, all right? I'm sorry, man. Come back out." And Tommy was like, You do? And eventually, after some talking, Tommy opened up the stall door and came out. And Nick was like, "Dude, listen, I do think that maybe what you're saying is true because you seem very passionate about it, and you were crying because people didn't believe you. So I've never seen somebody react that deeply to something they were lying about, so maybe you are telling the truth." Tommy hesitated for a moment. His eyes were like darting back and forth as if he was weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and he looked at Nick, and he was like, "You're right, Nick. I didn't go to school at Garten of Banban. I mean, it's just a video game. I just wanted to impress you and everyone else at school since I'm new here. But yeah, the truth is, I've never been to Banban's kindergarten or seen any of those monsters." And Nick just started laughing. He was like, "Yeah, you know, it was pretty obvious, honestly. Never really thought monsters were real." And yeah, they actually ended up being best friends. And 20 years later, they both even gave birth.